So welcome everyone to the third installment of our series today. My name is Abel Nunez. I'm the Executive Director of the Central American Resource Center in Washington, D.C. And I am also on the board of Alianza Americas. So this will be the third session of the Root Causes series of migration from Central America with voices from leaders and allies from the sub-region, working on economic inequalities, democratic governance, and the rule of law, climate change, and other issues. The purpose of this series is to raise the voices of Central America in an effort to collectively build a deeper analysis on the root causes driving migration from Central America in recent decades. We hope that this series contributes to highlight what needs to change to address forced displacement in the region. Today, we will discuss fiscal management and inequity. It is central to consider development and economic policies that are being implemented in each country and how they are impacting in the social and economic rights of their people. This is a key determinant factor for a life of dignity for the people in the region. This series is a joint effort led by Alianza Americas with a joint sponsorship of the Latin American Working Group, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, OXFAM America, Presente.org, Casa Yurumein, ONECA, Centro Presente, CARECEN San Francisco, Hondureños contra el SIDA, CARECEN in Washington, D.C. We also want to acknowledge the support of Latino Rebels who are sharing this event live on Facebook. So we have invited several speakers today for a conversation. I know that we're still waiting someone from Honduras. We sometimes with technology there are limitations, but hopefully he'll be able to connect. But I do want to introduce our two speakers so far. So first we have Ricardo Barrientos Quesada. He's not going to be able to be on screen because of difficulty with connection, but you'll be able to hear him. He's a senior economist at the Central American Institute of Fiscal Studies. Mr. Barrientos is an expert in fiscal policy topics. He has a doctoral studies in mathematics at from the University of Barcelona, Spain. He holds an international tax certificate from Harvard University. He serves as Vice Minister of Public Finance of Guatemala during the 2009-2010, in charge of fiscal transparency areas. During the period of 1994-2005, he served as Director and Technical Advisor at the Fiscal Analysis Unit at the Ministry of Public Finance of Guatemala. He's columnist in 2 Guatemalan media and has published in some U.S. media outlets. We also have Ana Iris Martínez. She's from El Salvador. She's an economist, graduated from the University of El Salvador. Ms. Martínez has an international master's in territorial development from the Polytechnic University of Madrid, Spain. She has another studies in gender analysis assessments and political economy and influence and campaigns. Currently, she is the influence campaign and communications manager from OXFAM in El Salvador, Central America. And our third speaker is Julio Ruelas from Honduras. He has a PhD in economics from the Colegio de Mexico. He has the Vice President of International Relations of the Autonomous University of Honduras. He was the Planning and Foreign Cooperation Minister from 2010 and 2014. Prior to that, he held a position in government. Julio Ruelas has a long academic trajectory and it is a professor in a number of universities in Honduras. So to all 3 of you, welcome and thank you for your time for this dialogue. So before we begin, what I'll do is I'll give you a set of questions and hopefully you can answer one by one. I'll call you. And then hopefully what we want is to also get questions from our audience. So I'll ask patients from our listening audience as they begin to answer the preset of questions, and then we will open it up to the public. So I'll start with this question. So how would you describe the economic situation of each of your countries, in particular fiscal management? So I will start with Mr. Barrientos, if you can answer the question.
Yes, of course. And again, please accept my apologies for not turning on my camera, but my internet connection is not good. Well, I will say that the Achilles heel of the Guatemalan fiscal policy is the tax system. The fiscal spaces in Guatemala are tight, not because public expenditure are excessively high, but because revenues are too low. Guatemala has explored other sources of income, like royalties from extractive industries, but in general, these extractive industries have proved only to be troublesome. They have created social conflict and keep marginal in size. The main source of fiscal revenues is, and is likely to remain like that, are those from taxes. On the economic side, I will highlight inequality in its diverse manifestations. The Guatemalan economy is stable, is characterized, is famous for its stability, and it grows reasonably well, but not everybody benefits from it. A clear example of this kind of disparities is access to banking credit. It remains an exclusive privilege for too few sectors and is cheap for the big companies with interest rate well below 10%, but excessively expensive for small and medium businesses with rates well above 20%, and almost inexistent for the micro business. So this kind of disparities are very common, and this is just an example, maybe one worth mentioning. This is Guatemala had many advances in transparency, but they have proven effective to prevent a huge structural problem, which is corruption. Also, there are important disparities. Fiscal transparency is advanced in central government, but lacking and very, very weak in local governments. Development council and municipalities systematically violate transparency rules. So that will be my comments and answer for this first question. Thank you.
Apologies, I was on mute. So now thank you, Mr. Barrientos. We'll move over to El Salvador. And so we'll ask Ms. Martinez to answer the same question. How would you describe the economic situation of each of El Salvador, and in particular, the fiscal management?
Yeah, thank you again for the invitation to be in this panel. I want to say first that before the spread of COVID-19, El Salvador was the country with the lowest rate of economic growth in Central America, with an average of 2% in the last 10 years. Also, we have huge disparities in poverty and inequality. In 2019, 28% of the households at the national level were living in multidimensionally poverty. This is almost 2.1 million people. And this is worse in rural areas where poverty increased to 46% of the households. In the other extreme, or in the other end of the income distribution, we have in the same year that 110 people concentrate a total wealth of $8.9 billion, equivalent to more than the national budget in 2020. And one individual of these groups or minority, one individual has a wealth of $5.4 billion. And this is equivalent to the total amount of remittances that Salvadorian people send to cover basic needs to El Salvador. So we are talking about an economic model that has generated poverty, extreme concentration of the wealth, and social exclusion and discrimination. And one of the face of that inequality has diverse manifestation, as Ricardo said before. In rural areas, for example, 26% of the households don't have access to water for consumption or for washing hands. That is so important right now that we have affected by COVID-19. So in many communities in the metropolitan area has access to water, but services is infrequent, so they have to buy water from private suppliers if they can afford it. According to national figures, almost a half of the households at national level living with some type of food insecurity due to many years of suffering the impact of drought and extreme weather. So we have last year the impacts of the storms Amanda, Cristobal, Eta, and Iota hurricanes. So these impacts in a territory that is vulnerable to climate change is a dimension very important to consider in the economic model. The projections for IMF for economic forecasts project an unprecedented 9% drop in economic growth. El Salvador is one of the economy most impacted by COVID and in all regions in Latin America. And we expect a slow recovery. And we always advocate that this recovery, economic and social recovery, has to be with equal opportunities. We cannot have a recovery only for one small group. We need to recovery with dignity for all population. So the economic and health crisis, we expect to have impact on labor markets, not only in terms of available employment, we are talking about job quality of the also. Most of the population impacted is going to be the women, because women are the majority of the workforce in the sectors more impacted by the measures to lockdowns implemented in the country. So almost 50% of women in the urban areas are employed in the informal sector. That means they don't have access with social protections. And so we think that it's a dimension that we have to take in account. So all these factors are drivers to force migrations in the future. So we expect an increase of migratory flows from Central America to the US, even with more restrictions at the borders and more violation of the human rights alongside of the road. I think the case of Victoria Salazar is an example of this kind of violations and vulnerability that face not only face especially vulnerable population like women, LGTB, indigenous people. So we have to thinking with a multidimensional perspective, but also with intersectionality approach. So the face of inequality in El Salvador continues to be that of a rural women. I think it's a face of that woman rural without access to opportunities that allow her to progress with dignity and equity and his rights. That is my first comments. You are in mute.
It's the most used phrase in I think in the internet in this 2020 and beginning of 21. So I apologize to everyone. But we have seemed to have lost Mr. Ruelas. So hopefully he can connect and talk about the Honduran experience. But just in the first question, we heard Mr. Barrientos talk about sort of the tax system that exists, the banking and credit, the discrepancies, the lack of transparency. Ms. Martinez talked about, the lowest economic growth, the disparities or wealth gap that we see, resources such as water, food insecurity, drought, climate change, how all of this are impacting particularly vulnerable communities. So it's daunting what's happening in the region. So let me go again to the second question. So in terms of public expenditure, how much is being invested in health and education? What impact did emergency plans as a result of the pandemic have on these two specific areas? So I'll turn it back again to Mr. Barrientos. So if you can speak about the experience in Guatemala.
Yes, of course. By any account, public expenditure in Guatemala is very low. Total budget hardly exceeds 13% of the gross domestic product. And with that, public expenditure is critically insufficient for government to comply with what the Constitution mandates or to comply international benchmarks like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. At ICEFI, we have estimated that without a deep, integral, and structural fiscal reform, including revenues and expenditures, Guatemala will fail, and I say again, to comply with the SDGs. Using the 1996 Peace Accords classification and system for classification of the public expenditure, for the priority social public expenditures, the government of Guatemala devotes for education around 3.5% of GDP, which is very low, and for health, it's even lower, just 1.9% of GDP in 2020, including the extraordinary expenses to face the pandemic. In a normal year, health expenditures are even lower. So with our calculations at ICEFI, for example, the Guatemalan government invests only $1.28 daily in each children or adolescents, amounting for a 3.8% of GDP. So this is a very, very low public investment for a sector which should be the first priority of every public policy in the country. Guatemala being a country in which half of its children, 1 out of every 2 a small boy and girl, suffers from chronic malnutrition. So there is no surprise why in the US you are seeing these huge amounts of unaccompanied children arriving, because they are living a country where they are not the priority, where they are neglected. Just taking account, just $1.28 it's invested by the government in a country, than 1 out of every 2 girl and boy is suffering from malnutrition. So it's very low. It's by any account insufficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. These are not sort of numbers that make you hopeful for the development of Guatemala. The numbers are speak for themselves, and I think that we can see how those link up to what we're seeing here in terms of people having or unable to live in Guatemala and making the very difficult decision of having to live their nation. So I'll turn over to you, Ms. Martinez, to kind of sort of answer the same thing, right? In terms of public expenditures, how much has been invested by the Salvadorian government in health and education, and what impact did the emergency planning as a result of the pandemic have on these 2 specific areas?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very good question. We know that to spending more resources in social protection is key to recovery and has to recovery with inclusion. That is something we always say. The government in El Salvador, I think, is one of the countries to invest more resources in social spending, spending social protection. We have experienced in the last year an increase in the public expenditure, closing in 2020 with a ratio of almost 30% of the GDP. And all the budget that the government invests in COVID-19 measures is compared with the Latin American region is bigger, is really important, 11% of the GDP, when the average in Latin America is 3-4%. But I think we cannot say that this increase or this ratio, we know that it's important to, we always say that in a crisis it's important to have more public expenditure to support the impact of the crisis. But we don't have enough information about how these resources has been spent, and if the mechanism from monitoring these expenses, we think that there is not clear and right now, and there are some indices of corruptions in public procurements, and we experiment, I think, here backslide of transparency. So I think for the measures that the government implemented was very important to have to do the impact less, I think. But we have a crisis, a fiscal crisis right now, that we have to look at some measures to implement. El Salvador is negotiation a new financing, a new loan with the IMF for $1.3 billion. But the last week, government declared a ban for public information for the vaccination and COVID-19 response plan. So this kind of thing concern to civil society organization, because I think it's important to include transparency mechanisms to monitoring that these resources goes directly to the people that really needs these resources for economic recovery, and also for overcome the health crisis and social crisis. So in this moment, I'm going to say that in our study, we analyze that compared with other countries in the region, El Salvador has taken important decisions about to increase the expenditures, but nonetheless, the evidence is not enough to say that this increase in the public expenditures really has been efficient and with transparency. I think when we have more information about the official information, public information, we can do this analysis. But I think it's something that from civil society organization we are asking for public information, to have more details about how the social protection, the spending for social protection is has been spent in this pandemic. And in this now, we don't have enough information for be conclusive.
Thank you, Ms. Martinez. I think it speaks a lot about the lack of transparency that the Central American countries have, and for the audience, just want to remind you that you can put your questions on the Q&A. I will take facilitator's privilege and then actually advance one of the questions that I think is relevant to what both of you were saying. And there was a question from the audience specifically on this area. If you can speak more specifically, what are the things that are spent when we say health and education? Can you talk a little bit or dig down a little bit exactly what that expenditure is? Is it primary education? Is it for education? Is it university? On health, is it primarily focused on preventative? Is it a universal system? How does the country, specifically in El Salvador, the money, the 30% that you say that they do put into the of GDP, how is it used?
So do you want to ask to
It's to both of you,
answer?
but also but I'll start with
Okay.
you, Ms. Martinez. Like
Okay.
specifically, and a short answer, where does the money go?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's we have information for 2019 about the education, because one of the question was if in El Salvador the education and health is free and is for all people. I think we have one of the system more universal. So we have importance advance and guarantee the access to education and health to all population, but we have an unequal access for this. It's not the same for all population. For example, in education, the most resources goes to guarantee the basic education. I don't know, in English is like a primaria. I don't know how it's
Elementary school.
Yeah.
Elementary school.
Okay. But it's not the same, the investment for the first years, para educación inicial, parvularia.
Oh, like pre-K and kinder.
Yes. Thank you. So we experiment most of the resources that the government investment is in these elementary schools, but then when you have high school and university, the investment is less. So one of the things that we suggest and recommended for the new education is we have to ensure that the kids, the children's under 4 years, 3 years, 4 years can access to education, because right now we have almost, I think is 20%, I think is to goes in these first years. And it's not the same for households that are in the more incomes, in the distribution of incomes is not the same. So that is, we don't have information about how spent the government, how spent the resources during the pandemic, because that information right now is declared as a secret, or the journalists and civil society organization cannot access to this information. So education plan and health plan to respond COVID-19, we cannot have access to this information. So there are 1 year or between 1 and 3 years that we have to wait to have more information about it. So I think that is the most concern for the civil society organizations, because we need data to have more conclusive evaluations about how the government respond in this pandemic. So I'm going to say that in the case of health system, we have also significant advance in the health system, but also this advance with the pandemic maybe is going to back for because we need more resources for invest not only in the communities, that the people in communities have access to medicines, they have access to input. So I'm going to say that.
Thank you, Ms. Martinez. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Ricardo, to kind of, if you can dig down that 13% of GDP that you mentioned that Guatemala spends in both health and education, if you can just explain what specifics and how is it done. And I also just want to tell our audience that Mr. Ruelas from Honduras, unfortunately, is having some connectivity issues. I think that there's a power outage where he is at. So we're going to try to get him, hopefully we can get him back into the session. But Ricardo, can you just speak a little bit more about what specifically what the expenditures are in health and education in Guatemala?
Yes, with pleasure. I first want to clarify, 13% of GDP is the total budget of Guatemala.
Oh, okay.
Is the total public expenditure in the country. For health, it is only 1.9%. This is the public expenditure in 2020, including extraordinary allocations for the pandemic, and for education on 3.5%. So 13% is the total budget, including defense, security, infrastructure, agriculture, etc. So it is a midget budget, really. So this is absolutely insufficient. For example, in education, at elementary school, coverage is around 30%. Most covered by the public sector, but coverage has been reducing over the last years. Even during the last year with President Jimmy Morales and with the current administration with President Alejandro, the target for Ministry of Public Education is to reduce coverage, not to increase it, reduce coverage of the system. And this is most, and that's it. It's elementary school. Coverage for is less than 30%. Coverage for school, kindergarten, and this kind of function is by far less than 1%, and university education, public plus private, is less than 1 or 2%. So coverage education is a privilege in Guatemala. It's a privilege for those who happen to live in places where there is a school or there is high school, and for those who have money to pay a private school. So the Constitution says that education should be universal and free, but reality is that there is not universal, less than 27% for high school, and in most cases is a privilege for those who have the money. And the Ministry of Education is the entity, the Guatemalan entity with the biggest budget of all. Is the titan, the budgetary titan in Guatemala. With that sort of trouble with coverage, and one of the worst cases is the health ministry. Our calculation shows that the current coverage of the public health system in Guatemala is adequate for the population that Guatemala had back in 1950. The current capacity, capacity and coverage of the public health system, it's just for the population that the country had more than 70 years ago. So the lag in the coverage and the development of the health system it has a delay of 70 years. And I am so sorry to say that the health system is one of the main targets of corruption networks. Corruption in the public sector is more frequent with public works and public procurement of inputs for the health system. Corruption in public purchases of medicines and health services, like, for example, heart disease services that are privately provided, paid with public money, is highly corrupt. Just a month ago, we have a huge scandal in public procurement of COVID tests because one of the most high-level authorities of the public health minister was selling false COVID tests, and they were distributed in the more far away highlands territories. By the way, the places where these false COVID tests were being distributed by the health ministry are precisely those territories where the index of migration are so high. So I will say coverage in health and education is extremely low. The budget is very low, and in addition, there is a lot of corruption making things even worse.
Thank you, Ricardo. Again, it's not, some of the things that we're hearing, are disheartening. But I want to turn the conversation more to addressing inequity, because that's a long-term effort. But I think it's important to have a concrete strategy for the countries, to increase equity, reduce wage gaps. But in your opinion, how would it be possible to achieve inclusive and sustainable growth that addresses the inequities that exist currently in the countries? And I think a second question is, how dependent are each of the countries on foreign aid to reach this goal? So I'll turn it over to Ms. Martinez to talk about El Salvador. Again, strategies on how to address inequities, and then two, how much is that funding are they expecting to be from foreign aid?
Thank you. I'm looking at the data for education, and just let me say that 50% of the budget to education, the national budget in education, 50% goes to basic education, and only 7% is going for kindergarten, and for high school is 9%. So you can see there are a lot of effort for guarantee the basic education and in the national policy. So it's something that has to change if we want to transform the system. Regarding your question about how can be more inclusive, or how can we think in El Salvador, and we discussed with other organizations, that we are going to present in April a report about the inequality in El Salvador. So hope in the coming weeks we can share with you these findings of this report. But we say that it's necessary in this moment a social deal for equity could help ensure a social and economic recovery process with dignity for all, with participation from all economic, political, and social stakeholders. Women's and youth voices are especially important in these conversations as these groups bear the brunt of the crisis of inequality and the impact of the pandemic. So in our new perspective, this social deal, or like agreement, a social agreement, we think has to include 6 cluster of policies. One of them related productive transformation that generates and enable environment for inclusive and human-centered economy development, to creation of good jobs and resilience to climate change. We have to invest more in the social protection system in El Salvador as a system, not only as the spending to education and health. We have to integrate all the social protection system. And in this kind of measure, we think it's important to try to closing the gender gaps and urban and rural gaps where inequality is the most pronounced. Basic income for vulnerable women, heads of household, is urgent, because during the pandemic we can see how the women face the most impacts of the pandemic, because the gender inequalities and structural inequalities. We need a more progressive and fair tax system that contribute to reducing multidimensional inequality and incorporate a gender lens in this. We think it's important also in this, and I think ICEFI agree with us, because we are working here in El Salvador in the same terms. We need this a more progressive and fair tax systems to include policies in revenues, but expenditure and transparency and civil society participations. The transparency and state citizen dialogue mechanism to drive the system and ensure sustainability is necessary. So we think in El Salvador, we are in a moment that is necessary to thinking in a new accords to involve different sectors of the society, and thinking how can recovery of the impact of the pandemic is an opportunity also to push for more fair system, for more fair economic model, because before the pandemic, that model was generating poverty, exclusion, and discrimination. And in a country that we have 3 million people living in US outside to the country, we need to bring them the voices of Salvadorian to living outside, to thinking with us how can redesign a new model for more inclusive economic growth and sustainable for the future in the country.
Thank you, Ms. Martinez. Before I go to Ricardo, the last question of that, in order to accomplish this, if there are financial resources that are necessary for El Salvador to implement this, do you see them doing it internally, meaning from their own resources, or are they really counting on foreign aid to support that work?
I think it's a combination. We have a space. It's not, we have a small space, but we have a space to do some reforms to mobilize domestic revenues, like with some incorporate or integrate some taxes that is important, tax to property, and also combat the avoidance. And I think there are a lot of measures that we can do. We are not or we don't agree about the increased VAT. That is some of the measures that IMF and government is discussing right now. We say that it's not the people in informal sectors or the population with less incomes don't have to pay the cost of recovery. So we say the VAT is not an option in this moment. But also we have to thinking and review the debt, how can structure the debt, because for this year, the debt is, I think, 91% of the GDP. So that is a situation that we have to analyze how can manage this without sacrifice the rights of the people. So we think we are also in negotiation with the IMF COVID-19 loan. So in this adjustment with the IMF, we ensure that the recommendations and the measure that the government has to implement in the next year, they don't sacrifice the sectors more vulnerable, and we can see our perspective that it's important to include another measures in the revenues and the expenditures also to guarantee that the measure is not going to affect the inequality. That is something is going to happen with a strong adjustment, fiscal adjustment. So I think that is part of the measure that we recommended. There are several initiatives that is important to implement, but it's not a technical problem. It's more than political problem, because if there are not a space for dialogue with different sectors in this kind of negotiation, the elites, the economic elites in the country, they have more power to influence in the decisions. So we have to guarantee that the sectors, the unions, the teachers, the health employees can participate in this discussion, because at the end, the decision that the government made in the next year is going to affect all the condition for the people here in El Salvador and also the people living outside.
Thank you, Martínez. And Ricardo, so back to you in Guatemala. What do you think are the possible strategies that can be done to ensure that we reduce inequality in Guatemala? And then again, the question, are they looking for funding from outside, or do you think that will come from inside the country?
Well, without hesitation, I will raise the need for a real fiscal reform as the way to face such inequalities. And by integral fiscal reform at ICEFI, we mean that wide approach is needed, covering the traditional areas of public expenditure, revenues, and debt, but expanding to fiscal transparency, fight against corruption, budgets more sensible to human and basic rights, and transversal issues like gender are really needed to be implemented in the country. But again, as it has been said, this is more a political challenge than a technical one. And I really agree with Iris with this because, you know, the recent history of Guatemala is plagued with many failed attempts. I will remember the attempts made at the peace accords in 1996 and the fiscal pact of 2000, and both failed, but failed for political reasons. It must be recognized that the real challenge is how to overcome the political resistance and not only the economic elites, the business sector, but people is rejecting this too. In a country that is still suffering the consequences of a long civil war. It was 36 years civil war here in Guatemala, and the damage is still present consequences are still felt. So there is no magical recipe to solve such a political problem. Of course, main resources for solve it should be Guatemalans solving a Guatemalan problem, but there is need for international aid, international support, and of course, an important amount of financial resources coming from the international community are required. But you know, I want to stress that this is not only a question of money, or perhaps legal issues are more important than money. And the international community has a role to play. And I'm going to state plain clear, crudely, if you want. When President Donald Trump decided to support a president like Juan Orlando Hernández in Honduras or Jimmy Morales here in Guatemala, a president whose government set a target for education to reduce coverage of elementary school, a president that was really worsening things in the health ministry because of this rampage of corruption and in public works, when the roads in the country were getting worse and worse with increases in public investment in roads. When President Donald Trump supported this kind of president, this kind of governments, in exchange for signing a safe third country for migration matters, you know, this president really ended fueling migration, increasing the urgent for Guatemalans to leave the country, to escape from these conditions. So I will say that we decidedly need more international cooperation and we need financial resources from abroad. But what we really badly need is more political support, or at least not the kind of political damage that we suffered under the Trump administration. You know, we are still trying to fix things from the Jimmy Morales government here in Guatemala. And you know why? Because this government has full support of Washington, of the Trump's White House. I mean, this is the president who expelled the CICIG from Guatemala. This is the president who expelled the only international entity that was doing something in the right direction against corruption and against tax fraud. I mean, this was the first time that the tax administration filed complaints in the court against big companies avoiding taxes and having direct impact in the immediate budgets of education, in investment, health, security, and so on and so forth. So the thing is that there is really a question of more international political support. And again, it's more financial resources are needed. That's true. But please, at least we need the political support. Don't do more damage like President Trump did. And I can speak a Guatemalan of my country in Guatemala. The damage was huge. I mean, a government from the United States of America supporting and fueling migration by supporting a corrupt government, that was no joke. Believe me, believe me.
Ricardo, thank you. There are a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to try to compress them because we're coming up in the hour and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. I think that we can continue to have this discussion for an entire day and we wouldn't exhaust it. But for both of you, what, you know, in the current context of this, what they're calling the immigration crisis at the border, they're talking about doing a Marshall Plan for the region. Can you give us your thoughts on that? I know, Ricardo, your talk is not just about money, but do you think this would be good? Are there other things that need to be needed? But also, can you be more specific about what the la canasta básica is in each of the countries, El Salvador and Guatemala? And I'm going to ask you if you can do it as quickly as possible, as we're coming to our hour. But I do think I want to highlight these questions that keep coming up, which I think are important. So, Ms. Martínez, I'll turn it over to you. So if you can kind of quickly, what do you think of of a special type of Marshall Plan? Is it good? Is it bad? And then what are the actual, la canasta básica, what is that and what are the actual numbers around that for El Salvador?
Okay, I'm going to try to do it shortly. I think it's good to thinking in the root, to address the root causes of migration in the countries and try to figure it and working with the countries and how can thinking in a plan to reduce poverty, inequality, and think in another economic model, because it's a question about the economic model. In the case of El Salvador, a model to generate exclusions in majorities, so, and keep privilege, so in a small elite, economic elite. So I think it's important to look at how can the sectors in the country, the different sectors in the country, participate in a discussion or a reflection about how can countries, or how can this plan is going to improve conditions and improve the opportunities for people decide to stay in El Salvador, or in the case that they decide to, is better goes to another country, is because it's the decision and it's a right. So I think it's a good opportunity right now to U.S. government to push Central America governments for more transparency, for more anti-corruption measures, to strengthen the institutions or democracy institutions, and support the civil society organizations to have these, to work more in monitoring the implementation of the funds, also to strengthen some legislations to to have more restriction for these influences from the elites. I'm talking about, for example, these lobby regulations, or transparency, how can these companies that they receive, for example, fiscal incentives, they have not only benefits from the public, from taxes, but also they accomplish human rights and labor regulations, and also environment regulations. So I think we need to strengthen the capacities, not only civil society organization, but the control of the state, because the governments in our countries, there are, I think, most of the cases captured by these elites, and the political and the policies that they implement, and some of the cases respond for these small groups. So we have to change that. And I think for change that, we need to strengthen capacities in the civil society and the communities and the people involved, really involved in the decisions. Someone in the chat asking about this minimum salary. We need a salaries to keep to ensure dignity for people. But we have seen in the last period is the minimum salaries is not enough for have a dignity and progress in the society. So we need that discussion, but that discussion is touch the power. So we need to create a space for have more these forums and reflections.
Thank you, Ms. Martinez. And Ricardo, do you want to add anything from the Guatemalan perspective?
Yes. You mentioned a kind of smart plan for Central America. I mean, the idea is attractive. And I think one of the merits and one of the keys for the Marshall Plan success 70 years ago was that it was well conceived. Its designers were able to correctly read the realities and the dynamics of the societies that the plan was meant to help to. So the same is for Central America. And I say that one of the main strategy for this Marshall Plan in Guatemala should be to try to approve an integral fiscal reform in order to make the government more fiscally able to do what it's meant to do, or by the to comply what the Constitution says that it should do. But you know, I will say the main obstacle for this integral fiscal reform here in Guatemala is corruption. So the ground corruption levels are the important setbacks in transparency, as the same that is has mentioned in El Salvador, fuels deeply rooted citizen distrust. So here is a structural problem. People don't trust the government. So no Marshall Plan is going to work if it not helps to correct this kind of distrust. So huge corruption makes even the people most needed from government assistance to oppose the reforms. In 2020, allow me to mention that the special programs aimed to face the pandemic impact proved they were people who say that they prefer to get ill or to die before giving more money to the corrupt government. Fight against corruption and effective transparency programs should be a key, if not the center element of this Marshall Plan. And because this is the key to open the hearts and minds of people. If this Marshall Plan is aimed to start to support real anti-corruption efforts in Guatemala, in Honduras, and in El Salvador, maybe they can give the start a step for a structural transformation in the region. Having disbanded and expelled CICIG from Guatemala and Maxi from Honduras, these were very, very serious blows against any hope of improvement. So that kind of actions, and I'm sorry to say it, but I'm sorry, but supported by the US government, by the Trump administration, worsened severely the conditions and the never stopping flow of migrants. And there is enough proof of that. So this Marshall Plan should read very carefully, and you should, and its designers for this new plan should engage locally with the people who understands and live the particular dynamic of every country, and read what are really the key points. And I'm sure to say to you, if this Marshall Plan repeats what the Trump administration did with the Jimmy Morales administration, it's doomed to fail. It's doomed to fail. No plan will work if we cannot stop the corruption in the Guatemalan government. Not for police, not for teachers and education, not for doctors and health, not for public works in roads and so on and so forth. So there will be no economic recovery. There will no basic basket, canasta básica. There will not be any improvement if this structural problem of corruption is not addressed properly in the right way.
Well, thank you, Ricardo. I think that will have to be the last word for today. We already have gone a little bit over time, but I really want to thank both of you, Ricardo Barrientos from Guatemala, Ana Iris Martínez from El Salvador. Unfortunately, we lost Julio Ruelas from Honduras. But what we can say is, some of those things that you both mentioned probably also apply to Honduras, and I would invite the audience to kind of continue to sign up for these sessions. It is important for us to share information. I think an hour it's not enough. Just want to thank you all for for all of your participation. Once again, I wanna thank our co-sponsors, Latin American Working Group, Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, OXFAM America, Presente.org, Casa Yurumein, ONECA, Centro Presente, CARECEN San Francisco, Hondureños contra el SIDA, CARECEN Washington, DC, and also Latino Rebels. So thank you so much. Thank you to both our panelists. You shared incredible information, and we really hope to for everyone to sign up for our next session, and we continue learning and hopefully creating new policies and new realities so that our gente, our community, decide if they do decide to migrate, it's not out of necessity, but it is because they are making a choice. Unfortunately, right now that is not the case. But once again, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.